All right, a little bit of a delay getting started today. I just had to mess around with some lighting in the back. This stuff is super tricky. I feel like wherever I put the camera, there's always this light beam just going straight across my face. It's super distracting. So either way, besides the point, got that figured out. So let's get into it today. This video and this topic is going to be a recurring theme on the channel. So this is something that I love to talk about and a message that I really want to get across because it's important not just to know what to do, but it's important to know why you're doing it and how it works. And I think that's something that's missing in a lot of lifters' mindsets. And it's something that I kind of had to figure out on my own. I never really had somebody to explain this to me, at least not very well. So learning this throughout my lifting career has basically helped me a ton. And the last thing I want to do is have everybody else go through that same thing and not really understand why or how this stuff works. So hopefully this video can be the end of that for a lot of you guys. Let's get into it. You can't force progressive overload. Obviously, progressive overload is something that is a key indicator and result that you're making progress. That's why you hear a lot of good, natural, advanced lifters talk about this all the time. I do think it's a little bit misrepresented, and I think it's explained in probably not the best way. So the reason why I'm making this is because I think I have a very good understanding of how this stuff works that can help you guys understand it a little bit better. So basically, my point here is that it's hypertrophy that causes progressive overload, not you choosing to overload and add weight or reps on the next workout. And I'll explain that basically throughout this video. That's going to be the main idea, and I'm really going to dive into that here in a second. Your training determines your rate of progressive overload. The more fundamentally sound your program and technique are, the more consistently you'll progress and you'll run into far fewer plateaus. So if you're training properly and you have the right frequency, you have the right fundamentals overall, you have the right proximity to failure, you're choosing good exercises, and you're overall training in a good rep range and doing a good amount of volume, there's no reason your muscles aren't going to grow. The only way that you're really going to stunt your growth when it comes to hypertrophy training is if you're missing one or more of those fundamentals. I mean, obviously it's a little bit more complex than just those four things I listed, but those are really the four things that will create a good hypertrophy training program or individual workout. If you execute that properly with good technique and form, the only way you can't grow is if you just don't eat enough or don't sleep. It's like these little outside factors they're not little, they're very important, but assuming those are all in check and at least in a good normal range that we should all be striving to be in, then it really just does come down to those four fundamentals of hypertrophy training. So if you have those down, you will progress. You can't force it to happen. And I think a lot of people talk about this backwards and just have a very backwards understanding of it. And when I say backwards, I don't mean they have it wrong, but I think they're understanding it literally backwards of what it should actually be. If you're just focusing on add 5 pounds or train harder than last time, not to call anybody out, but that's the best quote I can think of to get my point across, you won't last more than a few weeks doing this. And what do you do after those few weeks? If you're just training harder than last time, okay, you either have to start training at legit zero intensity and zero effort whatsoever if you can actually train harder than last time. And the only way you can actually train harder than last time is to make sure that the training session you have sets you up for success to execute a better performance in that next training session. You can't just magically say, oh, I'll just train a little harder and you just somehow magically get stronger. It's about executing the fundamentals over and over and consistently with a very similar technique. And it all comes down to these fundamentals. If you execute those properly, you will grow and adapt. That will allow you to then progress in the next session. It might not be the next session that you actually add a bunch of weight and reps to, but throughout those next few sessions. And I'll talk about the plateaus and whatnot in a little bit here. I would recommend watching my progression and plateaus video to get a better idea of how this stuff works as well. I got a quote here, again, quoting myself. I'm not quoting anybody else. I just want to make sure I can articulate this properly. If the fundamentals of hypertrophy training aren't properly set up in your training, any progressive overload you try to force won't work. If you're training too frequently or infrequently, not training to the optimal proximity to failure, or your technique is inconsistent, then when you add weight or try to overload, you're just tricking yourself. Maybe you can add 5 pounds the next session, but if your previous training hasn't been fundamentally sound, then that 5 pounds is being stolen from another area of your training. You're either sacrificing your technique by doing faster or sloppier reps, you're shortening the range of motion, using more momentum, or maybe you just half-assed the previous session, or now you're just taking it a little bit closer to failure. Either way, whatever one you're missing in this, that means you're overdoing it now, or you were underdoing it before, and you'll run into a harsh plateau within a couple of weeks because doing this is not sustainable. At the end of the day, progressive overload is achieved through training in the first place. If you do a set of barbell curls, and this is an example I have here, let's say you're doing a set of barbell curls for 10 reps with 0 reps in reserve, then you will adapt and eventually you'll be able to add either weight or add reps. If your training fundamentals are off, then adding 5 pounds or adding reps when you haven't forced the muscular adaptations to be able to do that yet from the previous session or sessions, then the extra rep or 5 pounds is just being borrowed from another part of that lift. Like I said, you're just going to steal from another area. Like if you start your training off with good technique and good form, but your fundamentals are off, or you haven't progressed at the rate that you're trying to force this progression into your training, then you're literally just going to start taking it from other areas. Like an example I have here is I started off training like a bodybuilder, and I was obviously a beginner. I was making linear gains. I was adding 5 pounds to my dumbbell bench basically every week or every couple weeks. It was consistently going up, and basically your rate of gains is just incredible when you first start, at least for most people. Obviously, everybody starts at a different spot, and everybody needs to get to a certain baseline to actually make what I call noob gains in the first place. I will have a video explaining that in the future. There are a lot of people that come into the gym expecting to make noob gains, and then they just don't make any noob gains, and there's a very good reason for that I also haven't really seen anyone talk about. I will have a video on that in the future. Anyways, side tangent over. Eventually you'll get to a point where you have a little bit of a diminishing rate of returns. And when I say returns, I mean your overall muscular gains. This basically means that your progress is slowing. Obviously, that's a very simple concept to understand. But if you don't understand how this stuff works and how progression, plateaus, and progressive overload works, there's a very high chance that you're going to start training incorrectly. And I say this because I see it happen to a lot of lifters, and I saw it happen to myself firsthand. I had great technique, full range of motion, and I was really training like a bodybuilder. Eventually I hit what I thought was a plateau, and okay, let's take my bench for example. This is the first one I plateaued on. It was my kind of genetic weakness. I've always been more of a posterior chain dominant guy, so deadlifts were always easy to me. Deadlifts was skyrocketing, bench was going very slow. So what did I do to break through that perceived plateau? I widened up my grip a little bit. Eventually I started arching my back a little bit more. This is actually shortening the range of motion significantly. And eventually, instead of doing a controlled rep, I started to bounce it a little bit more. I'd go a little faster, then I'd kind of bounce it, eventually use a little more leg drive. And there's nothing wrong with lifting like this. All this really is powerlifting, but taking these little advantages, you're stealing from your bodybuilding technique, and that 5 pounds you're adding or that 10 pounds you're adding or milking out that linear progression for just a little bit longer is literally just stealing from other areas of your training, and that being fundamentals. I hope that makes sense. Eventually that started to happen with my squat too. I hit a plateau or perceived plateau on high bar squats for a couple months, and it wasn't even really a plateau. I was just not progressing as fast as I was before because I had worked my way up to a pretty heavy weight. So I switched to low bar squats, and eventually I kind of widened my stance. I went a little faster. I wasn't going as deep. I just went to parallel to hit the arbitrary bare minimum for it to count as a squat. And it's these little things that allow you to keep progressing that are just stealing from the fundamentals of your hypertrophy training in the first place. I'm repeating this a lot because I want you to really wrap your head around this. I know it's a new concept to a lot of people, at least a new concept in a different way. It's a little bit different than the way it's explained a lot of the time, but again, I'm trying to make this, trying to articulate this the best that I can, because I don't think it's explained clearly enough, at least here on YouTube. So, to get back to my point about borrowing or just stealing other areas of your training to milk out that extra rep or those extra 5 pounds, this is the wrong way to train, and it's very short-sighted because you aren't actually hammering down the fundamentals that grow you in the first place, and you won't be able to train like this anyways for very long. If you do decide to train like this, you will lose your hypertrophy training fundamentals over time in order to artificially progress. I do highly recommend checking out my using versus abusing progressive overload. This is going to give a really good intro and overview to my philosophy when it comes to progressive overload and hypertrophy training. So to conclude this video, I have a couple points here just to hammer down so you guys can actually utilize this philosophy in your own training. So first point I've got here is that you need to keep consistent form and technique. Yeah, are there going to be changes in your form and technique over time? Yes, but if anything, they're getting better. You're not turning into a powerlifter. Again, nothing against powerlifting, but that's not what we're after here, so it's actually kind of just shooting yourself in the foot. Keep your form and technique consistent. I've said a bunch of times on this channel already, film your lifts. That will allow you to view if you're actually cheating. One thing you can do is you can take, I'd say once a month, maybe twice a month, film a couple different sets from different lifts, and you can basically start the clip when you start the rep, and then see if both the clips finish at the same time. If the second clip ends up finishing first, you're starting to cheat a little bit, and that's just some accountability. And it's not like if you cheat a little bit, you're just going to lose all your gains and hit a harsh plateau like crazy. But if that stays up over time and you keep spiraling down and getting more and more out of hand with this stuff, you will lose a lot of gains and you will leave a lot of gains on the table. And I speak from firsthand experience with this. It took me experience to learn this. It didn't take a new science video or a new study to explain this to me. It took experience, and you're going to learn a lot of this stuff through experience yourself and listening to experienced lifters. Progress will come with proper training. This will create adaptations, and you'll notice by being better in your training in the future. Example, if you take a set of curls to 1 rep shy of failure and get 10 reps, then the next time you take a set of curls 1 rep shy of failure and end up with 11 reps, achieving progressive overload. Again, you're not forcing it, and you're not taking that 1 rep shy of failure and basically turning it into a 0 rep shy of failure and adding a rep. You're still at that same, I'll say RPE. I know it's more of a powerlifting term, but you're still at that same RPE or RIR, whatever term you prefer to use. You're actually overloading. You actually made progress, and you actually built muscle. So this is what it all comes down to, guys. Progress isn't day-to-day noticeable. So when you're first starting out and you're beginner, or you're in that noob gain phase, progress will probably be noticeable day-to-day in the gym. Sure, but 90% of your lifting career, progress takes multiple sessions to actually see. In my previous video about progressions and plateaus, I kind of explained that we use basically these arbitrary 5 or 10 pound increments on most lifts. If you get 1% stronger on a 100 pound lift, let's say you're doing a lat pull down with 100 pounds, if you get 1% stronger every lift, and this is just the easiest example I can give, these are all arbitrary numbers, now you're probably going to be doing 101 pounds. Obviously, we're not going to add half pound plates to a 101 pound lat pull down. You'll have to do a few sessions until you can actually progress to the arbitrary plates that we have, which would be 105. So let's see, got that point down. Last point I have here is, because of this, you can still get bigger using the same weight. if you go slightly backwards one day, it's probably because of another variable in your life that affected that training session. Maybe you got poor sleep, had a bad diet the day before, didn't eat enough, or maybe it's the end of a training week or the end of a stressful work week. Yeah, it's fine. Every now and then you will do a little regression, which isn't a real regression. It's more of an artificial regression because your training's not getting worse. It's just a bad day. But at the end of the day, if most of your training is progression and you do have a little plateau or regression in there, it's not the end of the world, because if you go progression, 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 plateau, progression, then you take a slight regression, and then you have 3 progressions in a row, you're still going up. It's not going to be linear. You're going to be going up and down just like a stock that you're looking at on the charts. It's all about that end goal where we end up. So with that being said, I don't want to make this video overly complex or confusing, and I do want to leave it at that. So I hope that gives you a much better understanding of progressive overload and how it actually happens. If you have any questions or anything, leave them in the comments. I'm always checking the YouTube comments just to see if there's anything to respond to. So yeah, if you have any questions on how this stuff works, or if you think anything that I said was confusing or maybe you missed something, let me know. I'm always happy to get back. So with that being said, thanks for watching.